Division and Democracy. Stan Heuston for Church of Democratic Enlightenment. This is talk 3, about 25 minutes, following 1 A to E and 2 on radical feminism. On YouTube, search code Stan Heuston Agenda. This talk's source is local, appropriately to code, Tamworth, 50,000 people, northwestern New South Wales, Australia, and a Facebook discussion initiated by Lee Ivan in which contributors expressed concern that their vote at the elections didn't make any difference, an understandable concern, I think. First, I'll suggest that the actual problem about our vote not making any difference is the gap, or the gulf, between how much difference it makes and how much difference we are told it makes. There are very important reasons for telling the people that their vote makes a big difference. It is essential to keeping the people divided and powerless. Although how they vote makes little difference, telling them that there are these huge differences between our major parties, the Labor Party and the Liberal National Coalition, gives the people a sense of governing. They think if their side wins, they have made a big difference to Australia. Because one side always loses, the idea of massive differences between the parties underwrites permanent division. People go to the polls to fairly decide who will govern, and then it turns out that most of the losing side were only going to accept the result if they won, casting their vote in that sense under false pretences and then backsliding on their fellow citizens. This very much suits the political parties. It gives each of them a solid voter base of rusted-on true blue supporters who keep them in a potentially winning position, no matter how politically corrupt and degenerate they become. If the people don't stick together, they're not going to be ruling anything. To illustrate this, we'll take that unrepresentative swill, as former Prime Minister Paul Keating described them in one of his gentler moments, the Australian Senate. Nobody who takes any real interest in politics thinks the Senate should have a governing role. They know that Tasmanians effectively have 14.5 votes to every vote of a New South Wales person in electing the Senate. No matter, since many decades ago the parties made the Senate a party's house instead of a state's house, turned it into a constitutional relic, the opposition in the Senate has no problem voting down government legislation by itself or in combination with minor and independent political dogs bodies. It's the opposition justified in that role by the supposedly fundamental differences between the parties, and because the people are convinced about these fundamental differences, about half the people think Senate obstruction of government is fantastic. Not only do few government policies get enacted in the form they were promised to the people of the Turnbull government, none of the gay marriage referendum, the corporate tax cuts, the Building and Construction Commission, the National Energy Guarantee as a balance between renewable power generation and power costs, just to name 4 of the big ticket items, none get carried in the form mandated by the people with Turnbull's election. Listeners will understand that what government legislation gets through the Senate is compromised by the people's election of minor party and independent senators. As the parties degenerate with the complacency of their guaranteed true blue 30% each, and a pace of government so slow they can concentrate on infighting, people naturally vote in their disgust for minors in the Senate, ensuring that their own power of electing government is checked. That's what checks and balances now mostly means here and in the United States. The people check themselves. Australia's state governments are effectively checks in a nation of less population than Texas or California, with former member for Tamworth Peter Draper and former Prime Minister Bob Hawke, I'd abolish them. So, until the people stick together and say the coalition won government fair and square, if Labor blocks their mandated policies in the Senate, we'll slaughter Labor at the next election, nobody ever gets a turn at ruling. This may not suit the people who think they should rule all the time, but nobody ever promised them that. The Senate and the states aren't the only popularly depowering elements exploiting division. As long as that massive community hostility to the government the community elected continues, the media can keep the government on a knife edge, so it can bend the government to its own, the media's, policy preferences. This obviously applies in Australia to the Prime Minister. The PM is the head and power of government, said consults, but what the Prime Minister decides goes. The Prime Minister is thus the single biggest threat to media power. That would be why the people haven't got the election of a government and Prime Minister for 3 years right since 2004. Who says? Why, the people, because the press conducts opinion polls every fortnight where the people say the government they elected isn't as good as the opposition. It's pretty clear that the main reason they say this from one angle is that half the people rat on the other half. No PM has completed a 3-year term since 2007. So why wouldn't the people answer this way? As long as division among the people persists, the press can do exactly what its own power and profit requires. It can trash the government and Prime Minister as if the people's election of them meant nothing whatever, and as if mandate for the promised winning policies didn't exist. Lots of people think that's great, holding the government to account. Yet the people hate having their Prime Minister booted out too. That's the people for you, never happy. But they love a bit of drama, and that's what paper sales require, the drama of conflict, as Mark Latham, quoting Nick Greiner, quoting Richard Glover in the Latham Diaries, has it. Trash parties, Prime Minister booted out, chaos. Who are you going to trust to tell you how to think about politics? The media. Now, as I describe in The Press and Democracy, it often doesn't make much difference who you vote for by the time you get to the election, because the media, my emphasis is on Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, the Australian newspaper, will have bullied the parties into very similar positions. We can see Mr Shorten doing the deal with Rupert now. Labor has some savings, franking credits, negative gearing, capital gains and other taxes, so it won't blow out the deficit with education and health spending. It's being booted back into line on refugees as I write, the 12th of February 2019. The Australian will continue to lean towards the coalition, but Mr Murdoch is, by unconfirmed report, willing to put up with 3 years of Mr Shorten as the price of getting rid of Prime Minister Turnbull. Basically then, as long as neither Labor nor the Liberals are going to wreck the economy with debt, I'm told our Greek immigrants still draw their Greek pensions, how people vote mostly doesn't make much difference, and there are generally good reasons within the present system why it shouldn't. Provided, as we can see now with Labor, the deal is done about not bankrupting the country with debt, the policy differences between the parties are pretty much tinkering around the edges of government. The government can't refuse to fund schools and hospitals, the military and all the other services. Whether it's pouring money into schools without fixing them seems like throwing good money after bad to me. It's no big deal. If Labor wins, it'll have a mandate for that. Everyone expects it to buy the education vote. The extra money might improve things, who knows? And as I say in The Press and Democracy, it makes sense for the parties not to be too far apart on policy. How likely is it that there are two totally different answers to the problem of how to govern Australia for the next 3 years? The parameters of management are still pretty stable. Industry will produce about the same, commodities will sell with the usual price fluctuations, taxation will deliver about the same revenue, employment has been steady for years, about the same number of people will be on pensions and welfare, and nobody is proposing a different economic system. The other media besides News Corp will be the same. If the people united around final electoral decisions, the paper's current political content will be decimated, so they're keen to maintain the popular division. And all the people who've got into leadership positions of these ideological cults desperately want to maintain the division. You don't get to lead an army if there's no enemy. I'll do a separate talk on leadershiping, but there are probably people on The Guardian and the Sydney Morning Herald newspapers quite seriously seeing themselves as providing a counterbalance to News Corp running the country, defending the counter-ideology. They've been raised in the same post-Marxist culture of irreconcilable ideological differences. Even if they knew what was happening, why would they care? They're in a ruling elite, and who can read more than one paper before the train gets to Town Hall? The people may wonder about the media too. One thing they hate about politicians is they're slagging each other off in the circus of Parliament. But with no political organisation among the people, who do you listen to? Now, simply nobody is interested in a squabble between the papers about who's going to have the most influence in running the country. We don't want any of them, individually or collectively, running the country. We want the people running it, especially since by now we have some idea of how that might be done. The media's role was democratically doubtful from the start. We had Edmund Burke, 1729 to 1797, warning us, quote, "There are 3 estates in Parliament, but in the reporters' gallery yonder there sits a 4th estate more important far than they all," end quote. So that pretty much took care of parliamentary democracy, unless for some reason you doubt Burke. But the elaboration of the press's role has been as ominous as Burke's warning, and fortunately fairly silly. The press was to hold the government to account, as I quote News Corp executive Mr Williams in The Press and Democracy. And of course, I argue there that it is hard to see how it can do that without greater power than the governments. I try to imagine the press disinterestedly mediating a debate between government and opposition without interest in its own power, but that idea is, in today's climate, absurd. The only people we want holding the government to account are the people. Now, I think there are two questions we need to ask about this situation of elite and mainly media rule. In order, does it look okay and is it okay? On whether it looks okay, I'll be blunt. It does, because the people are being fooled into division. People suspecting their vote makes no difference are starting to see through the con, and that's it. And you can see why people still think things are okay. Only a clever, substantially effective deception as to the democratic character of society is credible. But in a nutshell, the present position of misplaced authority, though not misplaced responsibility, pretty clearly is bound to malfunction. It appears to be malfunctioning around the world, as the Australian itself tells us, and has led to a situation where the leader of the free world, 2 years after he campaigned against the mainstream media as fake and won, still refers to the media in the same disparaging terms, and rightly so. Power has corrupted. The media and the political parties are not the only corrupted institutions. My talks 1A to E and 2 are mainly on the universities, but on the media, a substantial takeover of government by another institution whose job is not the formulation and enactment of policy is pretty self-evidently dysfunctional. On the media's appropriated role, the Australians' recurring theme of reducing government debt may be sound enough, but from the outset, with interest on it at $1 billion a month, it's hard to see why the government would need to be told about it, even if we didn't have the example of Greece. I suppose private media magnates don't want the democracies collapsing and bankrupt. They want the media, the people, to keep buying the papers of a free press that's running things. But on examination, the media's role doesn't wash. Too much authority with no responsibility, too much suspicion of easy points on much harder issues, and of the paper serving its own agendas of self-promoting power and profit. There is a concern that in the absence of independent information sources in the community, the only source of information we have about this is the media itself. Nobody elected the media, and the media isn't going to face an election. The people can't answer it back or question it. With zero effective accountability, the paper can say what it likes. The paper's position of advantage is that all decisions about these things are trade-offs, choices between difficult options. So whichever way the government decides, you can always attack it in the name of the other options. And of course, the government is not going to get into the business of counter-attacking the media. That is probably the one massive waste of its time in which we can be grateful it doesn't engage suicidally. So even without knowing any of the detail of the government's reasoning, the media can say it got things wrong by supporting rejected options. Decisions on this are always both political and economic, and may be simply common sense practical as well. If the government attempts a saving, changes to superannuation was a case following the last federal election, and the paper thinks it's wrong saving for some reason, it will attack the government for that. 2 days later it will be complaining about the deficit again. If there is a savings measure that is economically credible but the government knows it won't get through the Senate, it may for practical reasons not proceed with it. It can be attacked for that, not taking a strong enough position on savings. The government may be finding, with things like drops in its revenue from fluctuating commodity prices, that certain times are not opportune for savings measures. Hold back the promised funding increases for schools. They aren't performing. Easy to say when you don't have to worry about losing the schools vote and the next election. Easy fill for your column in tomorrow's paper. And if the consequence of that is that an opposition with no commitment to debt reduction wins power, the situation of the Turnbull government for most of its time in office, the paper won't be losing the election. The paper is actually going to have a field day attacking the new government for its profligacy. Cut the government building program. The problem there is that nobody seems to know what effect any measure is likely to have on the rest of the economy, though that doesn't stop them all proposing different measures as if they do. Thus, even on the most apparently straightforward of policies, budget repair, the press seizure of authority without responsibility becomes a farce, a song and dance whose implication of serious responsibility for policy and serious engagement with government are fabrications. Once the media ceases to be the honest broker between the government and the community of the wisdom of government thinking, challenged by opposition thinking in a legitimate quest for representative power, and begins to push its own policy agenda in pursuit of its own power, the credibility of the whole situation rests on media deception and illusion. The media doesn't know know what advice the government has from Treasury, other departments and sources, or what Cabinet is thinking? And why would it be told so that it can attack it under the media's agendas? The media's usurpation of governing power through its influence on the people is reckless, though self-empowering and profitable in fine free enterprise tradition. In other policy areas, the compulsion on the media to criticise its ideological biases, personal loyalties, a dubious institutional relationship with the Prime Minister, its obvious rival for power, reduced the notion of its political dominance of the nation to farce. The Press and Islam, the twin of the Press and Democracy, looks at the Australians' role in policy on Islam following Mr Murdoch's tweeted view, including its incomprehension that Pope Francis, President Obama, as well as Australia's ABC, Australian Broadcasting Commission, and until he was brought into line, Prime Minister Turnbull, just to name a few, couldn't see its point, which was, as I cynically saw it, that terrorism was too good a story and Islam too ideologically unacceptable to conservatives for the paper to want to separate Islam from terrorism through, of all things, the Quran. We have in August 2018 been through another policy travesty on energy, the National Energy Guarantee, which was associated with the sacking of Prime Minister Turnbull, or as I will argue in Australian politics media sandpit, the policy pretext for his sacking, as I also argue, at Mr Murdoch's instruction. I'll sum this up from a report in the Sydney Morning Herald, 14 July 2014, and the Australian's Golden Jubilee, 50 years. This is David Dale, former editor of The Bulletin, on former Prime Minister Tony Abbott's work there before he joined the Australian newspaper as an editorial writer. Tony couldn't seem to get the idea that a feature for The Bulletin had to be fair and balanced. Dale said on Monday, I told him if he kept going like this he had no future on the magazine. Mr Abbott went on to work briefly in a concrete factory before joining the Australian as an editorial writer. The Herald quotes from the Australian's own comments, April 2, 2014, on its role. Quote, 50 years later, the Australian reports fearlessly, holds governments and institutions to account, and has consistently argued for big policy changes whose implementation have benefited the nation and its people enormously. Close quote. I wrote no more blah restore our vote opposing Abbott's sacking, and that's available at www.churchofdemocraticenlightenment.com as well. A second essential proposition I'd suggest with all this is that you have to consider our situation against a comprehensive alternative, that looking at separate elements of the program and proposing fixes for those won't work. Your fix in one element will be wrecked by the corruption in others. We've seen the alternative, simply the people elect a government and they unite around the government governing through the promises for which it was elected. If the people unite around their government, the current media role is finished. Unity is transforming. The alternative system brings the focus on the present slowness of government, at once one of its main deficiencies and an instrument of media dominance of it. Having written off the Senate and the states, I'm here suggesting that our only valid governing body is the Federal House of Representatives. It may well be that for all that the people despise politicians as stupid and politically corrupt compared to the media's wisdom and probity, the fact that government takes so long to do anything and seems accordingly ineffectual, for which it is also castigated by the media, is as big a source of popular contempt. The media did not write the Australian Constitution, but it thrives on obstruction and delay. Where the government is in the process of formulating policy, the media influences that formulation by arguing its idea of the correct policy, the one it will support with the people. But the government isn't just worrying about the next election, by which time the policy might have been tested on its merits, as it should be. The senators will be keenly watching the media for signs of what they can block with electoral benefit to themselves. So even before the policy compromises in the interminable negotiations with Senate minors start, the government is wondering as it formulates policy what will get through the Senate. The Senate opposition mostly gets off unscathed. It's the opposition. The minors have to block and obstruct. What else are they there for as protests against the government? And how else do they attract limelight? It all fills newspaper columns with dramatic conflict, makes the government and Prime Minister look ineffectual and the media the nation's only hope. All this is before we consider the fortnightly opinion polls, though of course it is reflected in them. As we know, the media now has a benchmark for the poll-based removal of the Prime Minister of any government. Do-nothings that they are, the negative poll results, a standing threat of press opposition to policy it doesn't support. Never mind that the standard is entirely of the media's adoption and the polls poor predictors beyond a few months, the nobodies in the party room who can sack the Prime Minister very much want policy to agree with the media if they are to retain their seats. Media policy, with a double L. Direct government by mandate, where, as I'll suggest, the government could enact 20 policies without obstruction on being elected, would eliminate the delay of snail government on which the media relies to control policy and government. There's not space here for what government might have done if it could govern instead of infighting, negotiating and compromising, beyond listing a few policy areas that seem to have been with us forever with their problems still unresolved. Multiculturalism, schools results, Aboriginals, fairness in the distribution of wealth, tax dodging and evasion, drugs and their continued prohibition despite its proven failure, university hostility to free speech, Western civilisation, climate research, regionalisation, land enrichment so we can sustain more than 0.33% of the world's population on 5% of its land, migration in congested cities, preventative health care for obesity, etc. The never-ending story of energy policy hardly gets a look in. No wonder people think you don't really have to take government seriously. Tim Blair, an Abbott mate I gather, comments on this in his article Art of the Impossible, subtitled "Congratulations Canberra. Following years of dedicated practice, Australian politicians have now perfected the craft of accomplishing precisely nothing at all." Quote, "Just a theory, but could it be that Australian politicians actually prefer limiting debate to the hypothetical and imaginary. This relieves them of the requirement to deal with real problems they might otherwise be expected to fix." Telegraph, February 4, 2019. Fancy News Corp spotting that in an article on energy policy. With a firm united support of elective mandate, we can see the parties with the real prospect of actually being able to govern going to the people with a serious portfolio of policies. That the parties actually applied themselves to this policy development would be a monumental change. Next, anybody with the slightest interest in the people actually ruling can devise mechanisms to overcome the fact that just voting for a candidate is indiscriminate as to particular party policy. A ballot paper, as well as the candidates, can list many policy titles which voters who are interested enough can rank in their order of priority for the party of their candidate when they cast their vote. There is nothing to prevent, say, 30 policies, each properly explained to the length of a page, being distributed at the outset of an election campaign so that voters can go to the polls with their policy priorities predetermined. Liberal and Labor will of course have a number of similar policies, so when those who vote Labor and prioritise the Labor policies give precedence to the same policies as those who vote Liberal and give similar precedence to similar Liberal policies, there hopefully is the basis of an expanded bilateralism in Parliament, unity among the people, a message to the media that the people have spoken. Not every voter will take the extra trouble, perhaps only those who think that the people are supposed to rule the democracy. Though, as further discussion of the Church of Democratic Enlightenment will suggest, some folk are going to have to do a lot more work than study 60 pages of electioneering policy every 3 years if the people are to rule. The removal of checks and balances like the Senate and the media's influence in its wisdom need pose no fear as to the soundness of policy. The other thing the soundness of policy lacks now has never been properly tested, blocked by checks and balances and media resistance. A government whose policies have been fairly tested over a full parliamentary term will have to answer for their success to the opposition and the people at the next election. Failed policies can both be reversed and teach us much about how to succeed. There is thus, as far as I can see, no cause for concern over soundness of policy from the people ruling. There is every cause for concern at the people not ruling, namely that the democracies are becoming unhinged because the people sense they are not in fact democracies at all. I think people ranking 30 policies and seeing their ranking given direct governing effect might feel their vote made a difference, but it would be the difference between two sound sets of policies, either of which would provide good government. Major differences of approach would occasionally present themselves to be argued like any other policy. The media would play a different role in the conditions of the government governing by mandate. It all seems possible, just starting from a civil unity of the people, leading to a reconstruction of governing machinery whereby who wins is supported by everyone in keeping their election promises until the next election. It seems little to ask. We don't need furious antagonism, but civil constructive rationality. We need democratic tranquillity, and in our choice of party and policy, degrees of excellence. On a final note, I try not to be too conspiratorial about this. Power does corrupt, but I think we have to look at the effects of the democratic debate becoming a product for sale. I'll return email the text of this free at churchode@gmail.com until I can put it on the Code website for sale. Thanks.